sorry, I don't know why YouTube's not working, but it should be. I think we're going now. And inshallah, we're going to be taking some practical lessons, inshallah, on how to learn how to become more resilient. So.
I'll keep trying that one. It's still not working. Okay. So, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us for the second part of this talk. Talking about positivity and resilience they really go hand in hand, and sometimes they're used almost interchangeably because a lot of the things that help us with optimism are some of the same things that help us with resiliency. So I was just going to start actually by talking a little bit about the definition of resilience, because a lot of people have different interpretations of what this means. And often we think of, really extreme role model examples of resilience. So we think of people who've gone through, a terrible tragedy, a loss of a child or a loss of a spouse, or something that's just kind of life altering. They've made it through cancer. They've, done something really, really big. And of course, those are examples of resilience. But resiliency is really a characteristic that all of us can develop, and something that we can all work on, inshallah. And really what that does is it helps us cope with challenges, any challenge that kind of comes your way. And so when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about the strength and the speed of our response to adversity. So i.e., how fast do we overcome it? When something comes our way, how fast are we overcoming that challenge? And the second part of it is how well do we respond to it? So what's that reaction that we have when we're faced with an adversity? And this is really something that, ultimately you want to be practicing resiliency before you're hit with a tragedy. And of course, right now we're in the midst of a tragedy or a trial. And so it's kind of hard to do that. But, I'm going to give some tips, inshallah, for us to do this together over the next little while. And usually I don't get to deliver this topic with an Islamic spin. So this is actually kind of exciting for me to do this with Ibrahim today. Because when I think about resiliency, for me, that word is so akin to my understanding of the word sabr. And I just wanted to maybe ask Ibrahim if you want to share the Islamic interpretation of that word and how that reflects into resiliency.
Yeah, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That's like a really important point, of course, and I don't know, we might have lost people on one of our streams. It's a really important point. A lot of people, when we talk about sabr, patience, for a lot of folks, that's it's a passive understanding. Sabr is this really passive thing, and the reality is that sabr is a very it's meant to be very active. Like usually when we tell people to have sabr, to have patience, they think the intent is stay at home and don't do anything, right? Like they think the intent is just sit on your hands, but the reality is that sabr is something that you're intended to do, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran uses it in a very active sense, right? So he says isbiru, sabiru, right? Like be patient, be persistently patient. And I think one of the problems is, what I just did right now is we talk about sabr as we define it as patience. Patience is part of the understanding of sabr. Sabr goes beyond just patience. It is resilience. It is perseverance, right? So when Allah is telling you to be patient, He's telling you to do something. And the word sabr comes from, al-habs or al-mana, which means to restrict yourself, to prevent yourself. And the idea is that you're limiting yourself to the worship of Allah. You're limiting yourself to the obedience of Allah. You're preventing yourself from the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's an active process of you channeling your energy, channeling your focus, channeling your ability onto something, right? This is why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, مَا أُعْطِيَ عَبْدٌ عَطَاء خَيْرٌ وَلَا أَوْسَعٌ مِنَ الصَّبْرِ. He said, no servant has been given anything more, greater, better, or more comprehensive than sabr. So sabr is a comprehensive characteristic that affects every part of your life, right? And so this is why it's just not just this passive idea or this passive ideal of just sit on your hands and then your brothers, I want to get patient, just be I want to get married and just be patient, just sit on your hands and do nothing. No, it means to be actively working on dealing with the issue, whatever issue it might be that you're dealing with.
Yeah, and that is essentially, for me, when I talk about resilience, that's exactly what we're trying to drive home, is that, it's the ability to accept the negative effect, the event, to understand it, process it, but still continue to move forward. Resilient people don't just stop, they actually continue to move forward, and they continue to work through the challenge. And a lot of times people think, when they think resiliency, they also think of athletes. And in the sports context, when we think about building resiliency, it's practice. So every time athletes practice over and over and over, and they're constantly practicing. Yeah, part of it is about skill building, but the other part of that is about failure. They want athletes to fail in their practice so that they can learn where their weak spots are, so they can work on those areas. And it prepares them for the next time they're in that situation, how to respond to it better, which is really what we want to do when we teach with resilience. So, some of the characteristics that people have, there's 3 characteristics that we kind of attribute to resilience. And one of them is that resilient people, they get that suffering is part of life. They understand that when tough times come, it is just part of human condition. It's part of human existence. And so, I think sometimes we fall into this like false sense of security where we think, if something happens to us, it's just us, it's only happening to us. And we really fall into it very deeply because for the most part, our lives are quite comfortable. But resilient people, they don't do that. They don't personalize the calamity that comes their way. So if they fail, or if something tragic happens to them, they don't make it about them, right? Because it happens to other people, and they understand that it happens to other people. And so they're able to contextualize it as an event that's outside of just themselves.
Yeah, and that's interesting because when you look throughout the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ is constantly told by Allah that, the hardships that he faces, the difficulties that he faces, the challenges that are before him, he's constantly being reminded, this has happened to people before you, right? Yeah. So Allah mentions, people before you were faced with these difficulties. We never sent anyone except that they faced difficulties from the corrupt people amongst them. We never sent anyone except that they were denied before, or that we sent people before you who were denied and rejected as well. And so this is constantly brought up over and over and over, ayah after ayah after ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this over and over. حتى إذا استيأسوا I'm forgetting the verse right now. Anyways, I'm forgetting the verse right now. It was on kind of like the tip of my tongue. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, even the prophets before, and they reached the point where they said, when is the help of Allah coming? And indeed the help of Allah is coming soon. And so this is all meant to tell the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to make him feel that you're not the first person to go through this. Yeah. You're not the first person to experience this difficulty and this hardship. And one of the famous hadith about this is the hadith of Khabbab ibn al-Arat. And Khabbab was a slave in Mecca, one of the earliest people converted to Islam. And Khabbab, he was a blacksmith, and his master, subhanAllah, she tortured him significantly. She had people basically scald his back in torture. And so he went through, terrible, terrible torture. He came to the Prophet ﷺ one day, and he said, أَلَا تَدْعُ اللَّهَ لَنَا أَلَا تَسْتَنْصِرْ لَنَا, won't you pray to Allah to help us? Won't you ask Allah to give us victory? So he's asking, where's our victory? When do we get to be the victors right now? And we're getting tortured and we're getting persecuted. When is it over? Is essentially what he's asking. Yeah. And the Prophet ﷺ stood up, and he got upset with him a little bit, and he said to him that indeed the people before you, so he's reminding him of nations before you, he said they were tortured as well for their belief in Allah. He said some of them, and he mentions the torture that some of them went through, very, very, gruesome, terrible things. And he said, and it didn't repel them away from believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, وَلَكِنَّكُمْ تَسْتَعْجِلُونَ, but you guys are being, and he said to them, before that, he said, and indeed Allah will cause us to have victory until it will be so safe that a woman can travel alone from Hadramaut to Sana'a, to 2 cities in Yemen, without fearing anything other than maybe, the dogs and the animals, the wild animals on the path. And then he said, but you are being too hasty. Right? And it ties into the idea of patience and resilience. Like, you need to be patient, you need to be resilient, you need to go through this. Also, you need to know other people went through this as well. Yeah. Right? Yeah. You're not the first person to go through this. Other people went through it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is, that's such an important characteristics when we think about resiliency. Is just that it doesn't become personal when you're going through something. It's really about the experience on its own.
Because there's a hint of like a tiny hint of arrogance there when you're like, oh, Allah's only doing this to me, I'm the only one getting punished, I'm the only one going through this difficulty. right? Whereas you need to be reminded other people have gone through this as well. Other people have done this as well. And the more you remember that, the more it brings you humility, and you realize that you're a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that gets you through some of this difficulties and sufferings.
Yeah, for sure. So the second characteristic that resilience people are really good at is that they're really good at choosing carefully where they place their attention. So, they really focus on things that are within their circle of control. So what are the things that they can do versus what are the things that are outside of their control and things that they have no influence over? And so this is really a vital skill for us with resilience, because naturally we're trained to identify threats, right? So as humans, part of our kind of flight or fight and like all of these these response mechanisms, they're meant to right away recognize when something is dangerous. And so when things negative are happening to us, our minds become very attuned. They really pay attention and they pick up on that. And when positive things come our way, we're less inclined to pay attention to those positive things. And so it's really easy for us to focus on those negative, outside of our control things versus the positive things that we have control over. And, they did actually a study with a group of people, and they said, every day we want you to just identify three good things that happened to you today. And they watched them over a span of 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, what they noted was that these people were happier, they were more grateful, and that they had less depression than their peers. And so even just a small exercise every single day of recognizing three good things that happened to you can really help you build that skill set of understanding, focusing on the positive as opposed to always focusing on the negative.
So I think, one thing to take from that is, the idea of tawakkul in Islam, the idea of trusting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that concept, even like our concept of belief in qada and qadar, belief in the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belief that, the pens have been lifted and the pages have dried, is the idea that, if that's the case, then why are you focused on something that Allah has decreed on? Why not focus on the thing that you can work with, right? So the scholars, they, some of the longer descriptions of what tawakkul is, like you'll find this, Imam al-Ghazali's written about this, Ibn Qudama, others, that when they describe what tawakkul is, when they describe what trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, they describe it as the limbs are working. So the person is doing the things that they're supposed to do. They're acting, if they need to get a job, they're calling, they're applying, they're asking people, they're doing with their limbs, they're acting, but their heart feels content, right? Because the heart recognizes that in the end of the day, it's in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? I can't really do anything beyond what like my actions are. If we talk about like COVID-19 and people afraid of getting infected, the believer should have contentment in their heart that whatever happens is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they do what they have the resources to do, right? They focus on what they actually have control over. So what you actually have control over, washing your hands, staying at home, things like that, you do the best that you can, but your heart needs to be content. Yeah. Right? You can't focus too much on what the results are going to be. You can't focus too much on what the implications or what might happen that's out of your control. Only focus on what you have immediate control over, that what Allah has given you immediate control over. Yeah. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned to us, إِذَا قَامَتِ السَّاعَةُ, if the hour begins, if the day of judgment starts, and you happen to be, you happen to have a seed in your hand that you're planting, and in the hand of any of you is a seed, then let him continue to plant it, right? Like, it's not up to you whether or not the day of judgment happens and the mountains turn to dust. And that's not in your control. What's in your control is Allah gave you a seed in your hand, and he gave you the ability to plant it. So just plant it, right? Yeah. And don't focus too much on, the things that are outside of your control, because that can take you to like a really negative headspace. Yeah,
and that's a really good tie into the third point, or the third characteristic, which is, even within the scope of your control, resilient people are constantly asking themselves, is what I'm doing helping me, or is what I'm doing harming me? And so, every step or every action, thought that comes their way, they're thinking, is this good or bad? So we think about, the COVID-19 situation, should I watch the news every 30 minutes? Is this helping me, or is this harming me, right? Is it making me feel worse, or is it making me feel better? Am I thinking about all the things I'm missing out on? Am I thinking about, the fact that I can't go to the grocery store as much as I want to, or I can't. So like, really it's these thoughts, and you're thinking, is this harming me or is this helping me? And if it's something that's helping you, then they continue to do those things and they quickly identify the harm and they're able to remove those very quickly. So those are kind of the three. And again, just kind of to recap, so they get that suffering is part of life. They know where to focus their attention, and they're constantly asking themselves against harm or help. So just before we get into some exercises about resiliency, I just want you to take a moment. So all of you that are on the line, just take a moment and think about a time when you had to face adversity. It could be anything in your life, and it could be anything, you know, as small as receiving negative feedback at work. It could be something as big as, you know, the loss of a loved one. But I want you to think about kind of just one thing that you've gone through. And I really want you to think about what effect that had on you and what kind of reaction you had to it. So, you know, were you, you know, did you isolate? Did you go internal? Did you want to talk all the time? Like, what was kind of your reaction to that event, and how did you get through it? And the reason I want you to do that is twofold. One, everybody on the line will be able to think of something. Every single person has gone through some event that for you personally felt like a calamity. It felt like something that was negative for you. And every single person will have this. The difference will be is how you reacted to it. So did you come out of it stronger and more resilient, or did you do certain actions that actually caused you to do some self-harm in that piece? So just kind of, you know, think about that and think about how you responded and how quickly you responded. So when we talk about resilience, we really think about it on a sliding scale. So you go from coping to thriving. And when an event occurs, you first start in that coping phase, right? You have to process the information. You have to understand what's happening. You have to, you know, you have to be able to internalize it. And so that's kind of the coping piece. And then you move into thriving, which is once you've passed it and you've gone through it, you will come out of it hopefully stronger. Now, resilient people get to that thrive space a lot quicker. So sometimes they'll get to that even during the calamity, which is what I'm going to try to encourage us to think about now during COVID-19, is how do we get into that thriving phase? And so it's really important that we identify kind of what works for your coping mechanism. So the first thing is to identify what works for you. And coping is interesting because people have different ways of coping. For me personally, I know I really like baking when I'm stressed out. I really enjoy like the smell of fresh baked goods, and it makes me feel really good. I know for some people it's exercise, for some people it's meditation, for some people it's, you know, spending time with other people. Like everybody has a coping mechanism that works for them. And it's really important for you to think about what works for you, because it's not like a cookie cutter solution. If I had to work out when I was going through something bad, right, that would stress me out. Like if I started to think about losing weight, for example, during a bad situation. And the one piece I really want to encourage you here too is to think about avoiding isolation, because isolation really does have a negative mental health aspect. And I know we're all in isolation. Right. But we're so blessed that we live in a time where we can connect with people virtually. So, you know, whether it's texting, calling, FaceTiming, like find a way that you're connecting with people constantly. Yeah. Because if you're not doing that, you can slide backwards really quickly.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a lot in our deen about, you know, meeting other people, obviously praying in Jama'ah, praying in congregation. Obviously we can't do that right now, but you know, there's a lot of aspects of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said two people love each other for the sake of Allah under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment. So there's a lot about, you know, when you're a believer is that you're not supposed to be super isolated. You're supposed to be connected to other people, connect to your family, connect to other Muslims. And so this is a really difficult time from that perspective. Yeah. But like you said, Allah has given us this amazing thing called the internet. Yeah. Because honestly, if we didn't have it, a lot of us would be really going crazy at this time. So alhamdulillah, we have it, and we can remain connected with people.
Yeah, of course. And two of my closest friends live in different countries, and we know everything that goes on in each other's lives. Like that's just how easily we can still connect now. Tip 2 is understanding that what you're going through is not permanent. So one of the easiest ways to cope is to recognize and time box what you're going through. And so anything that you're going through always has an end, right? Anything that you're going through, it's not going to continue forever. So yes, we're going through this COVID-19 situation right now, but you're not going to go through it forever. There's going to come a time where this is over, inshallah, right? There's going to come a time when we're outside of that, and that there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel. And so the faster that you can time box that is the faster that you can start to come out of it, meaning the faster that you can stop focusing on how long it goes on. People who are resilient, they don't become consumed by the incident. So if you are right now in this COVID-19 situation, that doesn't become their life. It's something that's happening. It's eventually going to end, and they continue with everything else that they're doing, and they really time box that.
Right. Yeah, and this is something that the believer should really always have this concept that nothing is permanent, including the dunya, including the suffering in the dunya, including whatever difficulty that you're going through, right?
Yeah.
You have to believe that. Obviously, this dunya is really limited, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, so in the Quran, تِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, these are the days we give people insurance, which means one day is good, one day is bad, one day you're on top, one day you're not. This is the sunnah of life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen. And Allah Azza wa Jal tells us, إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا, with the hardship is ease. Not, there's another verse that says, إِنَّ بَعْدَ كُلِّ عُسْرِ, that indeed after the hardship there is ease. But then this verse says, with the hardship, during the hardship, there's ease. So after it, there's ease, and during it, there's ease. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed, comfort in the situations that we're in, even the difficult situations that we might be in. And the believer has to always remind themselves of this, right? That in al-aqibata lil-muttaqin, the end result is for the one who has taqwa, to constantly remind themselves, like at the end of the day, the believer is going to succeed. In the end of the day, the difficulty is going to subside, right? And the example we gave earlier, when Khabbab comes to the Prophet and he's complaining and he's saying, like, when is this going to end, right? Basically, he's saying that.
Yeah.
And the Prophet tells him, one day this issue, i.e. Islam, is going to become so prominent, and it's going to become, the main issue, like it's going to become the main religion in the area. So much so that a woman will be able to travel unharmed, right? And so he's telling him, like, envision that this is going to end, and it is going to end. And that should be something the believer always does, right? To envision, like, this is going to end at some point, and to realize this is not a permanent state that you're in.
Yeah, for sure. So from coping, we can start to move into thriving. So once we've kind of figured out what helps us cope, what helps us feel better, how do we time box these incidences, we can really start to move into thrive. And there's a few ways that we can do that. One is to create learning opportunities, right? So reflect on what's happening and really think about, what can I learn from the situation that I'm in right now, right? And I think a lot of us are doing a little bit of self-reflection right now to say, what are those things I took for granted? What are those things that I really wish I'd spent more time on? And it could be, visiting your family or spending time with your parents, or just those things that, sometimes we saw perhaps as, extra time, and now we're thinking, oh, I wish I had that, right? Going to the masjid, going to even just going to the grocery store, but like, just what are those things that you really enjoyed doing? And then that way, inshallah, when this is all over, you're able to re-inject that.
So I think, like, a lot of people are spending a lot more time with their kids, and they're realizing, like, their kids actually really needed them to have that more time. So it's like, after this is over, now that you've gotten a chance to reflect on this, and you've created this, learning opportunity of reflecting on it, you could say, okay, even after this is over and I go back to work, I'm going to find a way to make more time for my kids.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Or now that I really feel like disconnected from the masjid and it's breaking my heart to see the masjid empty, I'm going to make sure that, I find a way to incorporate the masjid more into my life.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the things that we take for granted. And then within that too, because I'm talking about kind of how do we get into thrive while we're in it as well, is, what were there things that you wish you could have done that you could maybe do something now different? So for example, if you wished that you spent more time with a volunteer organization, can you donate to that volunteer organization? Like, can you do something that helps you get to, supporting or being a part of that when you're done, inshallah, right? So whatever it is, just kind of take a moment and think about that as well, is what can you do right now to reflect on that learning? So again, like I said, anything that you plan to do differently, perhaps even trying to do baby steps now to help will get you there, inshallah, when this is over. The second part is implementing positive self-talk. So one of the things that we find with resilient people is that they talk to themselves in a really positive way. They're very aware of, the fleeting thoughts that go through our minds. And, we do an exercise where we, ask people to just become a little bit more aware of what they're thinking about and then, check back in the next day. And it's really interesting how much you realize all the negative things that you say to yourself constantly, and you may not even realize it, right? And so it's implementing positive self-talk and reframing the things that you say to yourself. So even right now, like, am I saying to myself, am I saying to myself things like, oh, COVID-19 is gonna kill me, or it's gonna hurt so many people, or it's gonna, all these things that really end up affecting our mental state? Or am I looking at positive things to tell myself, which is, alhamdulillah, like, I've got a roof over my head, this is much better than, subhanAllah, what some of our Muslim brothers and sisters have gone through around the world. Like, what are the things that you can say to yourself to start thinking in a more positive manner?
Yeah, no, definitely. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. As for the blessings of your Lord, then speak about that. So the believer should always be, taking the opportunity to think about what are the things that are, the blessings of Allah in my life, and how can I remember them and create that, positive mental framework. I'm also reminded of Ibn Qayyim rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, who had a statement. He said, beware of the fleeting thought, because then it becomes the ardent thought, like the thought that is predominant in your mind. And beware of the predominant thought, because then it becomes your action. And beware of your action, because then it becomes your habit. Right?
Yeah.
And so he's telling you that the believer should always be on guard. What am I thinking? What's going through my head? And is this a positive thing? Is it going to lead to a positive place? Is it going to lead to a negative place, right?
Yeah.
So when you have this like really negative self-talk, and you're just saying, oh, you're the worst at this, you're terrible at this, and you're just kind of beating yourself down, like, you need to catch that thought, right? Because it can lead you to some really, terrible places. Oh, I'm so bad because I did this, I did this wrong thing, or I did this bad thing. Then it leads you to just giving up. Then it leads you to acting in a way that you shouldn't normally act. And it might lead to like really bad habits down the road. And breaking that bad habit is really difficult. So the best thing for you to do is to create positive self-talk, to try to negate that negative self-talk that might be happening in your mind.
Yeah. And again, I mean, we see this a lot with athletes, right? And people who are really successful. Like, you hear about, Bianca in her tennis match, she, before every tennis match, she writes, I won on the inside of her hand. Obviously she doesn't win every single one, but it gets her into that mind shift that, she's going to win. Right. And, we hear this a lot, people, I've heard stories of people saying, like, just putting the word doctor in front of their name from a young age, right? And they kind of they ingrain that into their minds that one day they're going to see this is going to happen. And so that really, that positive mindset and thinking about the success and thinking about the positive does impact your actions and the outcome.
Yeah. Like, even yesterday we were Tuesday, when we had the conversation on optimism, we talked about, the hadith of the Prophet while they're constricted in Medina during the Battle of Ahzab, and he's breaking the stone, and he's saying, Allahu Akbar, we've been given the keys to the palaces of Yemen, the keys to the palaces of Asham, the keys to the palaces of Persia. And even though, of course, the Prophet ﷺ is receiving wahi, and he knows, Allah is going to, tell him of these things that are going to happen in the future, there's still element of envision that this is going to happen, right? And he's trying to get the companions as well to envision this, right? To envision that this will happen in the future, so that when you have that positive frame of mind, it motivates you to act in a positive way as well.
Yeah. Very good. So, and that really ties in well with kind of our last piece here, which is on refocus. So a lot of the time we spend together talking about resilience, we focus on mental exercises. And one mental exercise that we use that's actually very easy to use is a refocus exercise. So if everyone on the line wants to just kind of close their eyes and spend, a second here thinking about something that really makes you proud, or something that really makes you happy. It can be a family member, it can be an accomplishment, anything that really makes you happy. Just kind of take a second and just close your eyes and think about that.
Should I close my eyes too?
You should close your eyes too. And just kind of take note of the sensations in your body, like how you're feeling, if you're feeling a little bit more calm. A lot of people's heart rate starts to slow down. Some people even start smiling. It just kind of happens naturally when they're thinking about that positive thing. And so what we found is, and you can open your eyes now, what we found is that, just those little simple, moments in time where you can just take a moment and refocus, just like 1 minute, literally 60 seconds. They can really lower your cortisol levels. So if you're in the middle of something that is extremely stressful and you just take a moment and you pause and you think about something really positive, it can take you out of that really stressful and back into that positive mindset. Right. And even just in our daily lives, like I think about, sometimes when I'm really upset with the kids for doing something, like if I just take a moment and think about something really good they did that day, or something really positive, or something really cute or funny, I'm less likely to be as upset with them, right? It just kind of calms you down. And so, just do that. Anytime you find yourself, your mind kind of racing with this COVID-19 stuff, and you're thinking about, all the things that could go wrong, and you feel your mind start to snowball, just take a second and think about what's really positive in your life right now, or what is one thing that really makes you happy. And you'll notice that chain, like it just kind of interrupts the chain of thoughts, and it really helps you kind of get regrounded again. So that's another way to help you build resilience, inshallah.
So inshallah, if any of you have questions, we definitely would love to hear from you, inshallah, before we wrap up. I know there's some on Instagram. Sorry.
Oh, did you watch us sideways the whole time? I don't actually know how Instagram works. So someone says, I feel bad for those who are struggling and who are having financial difficulties, or divorced families with custody issues, or single parents. Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's different levels of struggle within what's happening right now, and I think people are going through lots of different challenges. And so the idea is that these can work for everyone. Like you can kind of personalize these tips so that it works for you. From a personal perspective, if you're not one struggling with those things, that's one thing to be grateful for. But if you are struggling with those things, again, try to find outlets, try to find people that you can talk to. Don't socially, don't isolate yourself, physically isolate, but don't, emotionally isolate yourself. And really just kind of try to tap into some of those positive exercises that we just did right now.
And see Sister Fawzia, assalamu alaikum, sister. She said, I've lived in Canada for 27 years. For 25, I've lived alone without family or friends. No one visits, and I don't visit people. I've been socially isolated for most of those years, so for me it only became easier when I truly began to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consciously. Before then I was depressed and lonely. Now my isolation is a blessing that I no longer take lightly. Alhamdulillah, ala kulli hal. Part of the reason is because my mother passed away barely 2 years after I moved to be with her, and also due to living with major illnesses. Now I can say I've become resilient through my trials. I'm truly grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah, and subhanAllah, that's the blessing of trials and difficulties, is that when you come through the other end, you always end up looking back and you say, subhanAllah, that trial and difficulty that was so difficult, that caused so much pain and suffering and tears, actually was to my benefit. Actually ended up being a positive thing. And that when that happens, it kind of should have us to think that the future problem that we have, the future difficulty that we have when we get there, to think in that moment, well, remember the last time I thought my life was over and everything was falling apart? It actually turned out pretty good, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise. He knows what's best for us. Whatever difficulty I'm going through today, inshallah, it's going to be something that in the end is going to be worth it. When I get through this, with my belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intact, I'm going to look back on it and say, that was actually not so bad. That was actually pretty cool, etc., etc.
It was a blessing in disguise.
It was actually a blessing in disguise, right? I mean, if you think of Umar ibn Khattab, like when he was with the Prophet ﷺ and they had so many difficult times, and then when he becomes the Khalifa, the Muslims are so powerful, they've taken over half the world, they have so much money, and he remarks to his companions, he says, the best days we lived was in patience. Like the best days we lived was with the Prophet ﷺ, things really difficult, feeling constricted, but those were the best days. The brotherhood, the bonding between the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ was like the strongest. Like when you think back at the end of your life, what are you going to think of when you reflect on your deathbed? What are you going to say were the best days of my life? Is it going to be the day where you're sitting on a throne with luxurious clothes? Or is it going to be the day that things were really tough and you were with, your other friends and you were commenting on the tough days and living through those difficulties, right?
Yeah.
So they end up being the more valuable days in the end of in the long picture.
Yeah. I think that there's some things that we go through that in the moment and at the time and even after, I mean, they don't necessarily feel, you might not have a positive attribute to them, but really it's about what you do and how you react to it. That's the part that is what gets you through, and that's the part that's important. So if I think about, somebody, losing a child, that's, I don't think, you'll ever look back and say, good, that's not going to happen, or losing a parent or anything like that. But it's, what did you do differently after it? Did you set up maybe a charity for them? Did you, become more, did you volunteer more? So like all the things that you did that were different because of that test, because it helped you, become a better person. I think that's where the blessing in disguise comes in. So I want to make sure we're not taking away from any experiences there.
I don't see other questions. If there are, I'm sorry that I can't see them. But Jazakumullah khair. I hope that this has been beneficial for everyone. I actually benefited a lot from the presentation myself. And there's a lot for me personally to sit back and to reflect upon and to ask myself, like, how many times am I creating learning opportunities for myself, and to ask myself, like, how often am I engaging in positive self-talk versus, negative self-talk, and to get myself to refocus. I'm going to be honest, a couple of times, just thinking of this whole COVID-19 stuff and, the implications of it, how long it might go on, like, it's given me a little bit of anxiety, but, to take the tips that you talked about, of like doing that mental exercise and thinking about things that you are grateful for, I think it can tend to calm you down and realize that, like, you've got a lot, and, like, in the end of the day, it's not a big deal, and be able to have some perspective.
Yeah, and we're still living it, so you will move between coping and thriving, right? So when I say move out of coping and go into thriving, it's not as simple as just being done and moving on. It's a bit of a continuum that sometimes you will slip back a little bit because we're still in it. But once it's over, inshallah, these tips are what help you really get through them, and then once it's over, you can move past it much faster. But just that recognition that it's okay sometimes to feel down. It's okay sometimes to worry and to have anxiety. But, inshallah, just continue to practice these things, and inshallah, we'll get through it together. Jazakumullah khair, everyone, for attending today. We hope, inshallah, that it was beneficial. And, if there's other topics that you ever want us to cover, inshallah, let us know. And we'll try to tag team it. Doesn't always work, but we'll try, inshallah.
Just a couple of things, inshallah, for everyone to pay attention to. We have a couple of more live streams coming on Saturday. The really popular program we do, which is story night. So we do story night with my kids, and I tell them a story, and inshallah, I hope you can bring your kids, inshallah, and they can hear the story as well. We're going to do the story of Prophet Yunus, inshallah, Saturday at 6 p.m. So it'll be on all these same channels that we're currently doing it on. So on Facebook and on Instagram and on YouTube as well. And also Friday, we're going to give a Friday message at the same time that, the khutbah typically would be done. So Friday at 1:30 p.m., inshallah. We encourage people to hear that. Maybe bring your family, let them hear it as well. And then you can pray 4 rakahs of dhuhr at home, inshallah. So that'll be Friday at 1:30 p.m. And Saturday, 6 p.m. is the kids story night, inshallah. Recommended ages, between ages of like 3 to 12. That's how we kind of cater it for them. And this time it'll be the story of Prophet Yunus, inshallah.
Great.
Jazakumullah khair. We'll see you guys soon. Just one last request. The masjids are going through a lot of difficulty with their doors closed. I just want to request everyone, inshallah, to head over to the masjid website, daratawheed.ca, and make a donation, even if it's $5, $10, $20, the normal donation you would give when you go to the masjid every week. Please, inshallah, we're desperately in need of it. Please make those donations, bi'idhnillah. We really rely on your support and urgently need it. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.